So last night on Monday Night SmackDown, they paid tribute to Hulk Hogan with a 10-bell ring salute like they do every time a major wrestler dies. And all the wrestlers stood on stage paying, they were... there were a few folks in tears, but I think a lot of the folks were like, yeah, we could care less about the Hulkster dying. Because the guy was truly, honestly, he built the business, but at the same time, he was a total asshole. Especially to other wrestlers. And the story was that, it's a big, long-ass story. Now, I know I gave the Hulkster Bee-otch of the day a few days ago, but I need to tell you more about why Hulk Hogan was a total thug. And unfortunately, a lot of it fell on Vince McMahon's hands, too. Because Vince also played into it. Now, I hate to break it to you, but Vince McMahon, a lot of people like to say that Vince was a total asshole for breaking up. Once upon a time, there was a system called NWA, not the rap group, but the National Wrestling Alliance. And what had happened was it was made up of all these individual wrestling organizations. And the McMahon family had, their organization was originally called Capital Wrestling Corporation, and then it became the Worldwide Wrestling Federation, WWF, and then they dropped the wide and became simply WWF and then WWE. So what happened was so anyway, Vince McMahon, Vince and Candy McMahon, the former head of the WWE, was born in 1945 in North Carolina. And his father, of course, was the elder Vince McMahon, Vincent James McMahon. And his mother was named Victoria. Victoria, by the way, lived to be like 102 years old. And Vince took excellent care of her until the day she died. As a matter of fact, Victoria, up until just before she died, she was an avid tennis fan. And Vince, I guess, in her name, donated a lot of money to build like a tennis court at her nursing home or wherever she lived. So, anyway, here's the rest of the story. So, Vince and James McMahon, the elder Vince McMahon, abandoned the younger Vince and Victoria when Vince was a baby. And so what happened was, when little Vince was an infant, Victoria had to look, she had to live on one income, and she dated several guys. She looked for somebody who was willing to take care of her and take care of little Vince. So what happened was, so the story was, they actually, so what happened was Victoria found this guy named Leo Lupton. Leo Lupton was his name. And Leo was a loser. But he ended up adopting little Vince McMahon. He actually gave him his last name of Lupton. And they became, he actually was Vinnie Lupton for several years. And together, the three of them lived in this rundown trailer park in North Carolina. So what happened was, while he was you know, in his, you know, up until he was 12 years old, poor Vince had a lot of problems. He had dyslexia. He didn't do well in school. I guess he had to repeat several grades. The trailer, you know, he had very few friends, and the older kids at the trailer park would come to him and sexually assault him. He said that when he was a little boy, they used to grab his penis all the time, and then when Vince got older, actually when Vince was living at this trailer park with Vinnie Lupton, he used to watch Vinnie, not Vinnie, yeah, I'm getting my, sorry folks, I'm focusing on driving at the same time. So this Leo Lupton guy beat the living crap out of Victoria. They were, it's like they got into multiple fights. Vince was hurt, you know, it was like he didn't have a happy moment in his young childhood. And then finally, his mother stepped in and said, "Son, I totally agree. You need to have a good father figure, and who else but your real dad? You do have a real father." And he lives in New York. He has a lot of money. He started this wrestling thing with his brother. So, long story short, she finally got a hold of Vince's dad, Vince Sr., the elder Vince, I should say. I don't think they were really junior and senior, but a lot of people call them that. So, long story short, Vince Sr. heard about what was going on with the younger Vince, and what happened was the elder Vince finally said, "Okay, I'll go ahead and allow the younger Vince to live with me." The two finally met when Vince was 12, and they did hit it off. Vince, the younger Vince, learned the ins and outs of the wrestling industry, and anyway, what had happened was Vince, the younger Vince, wanted to be like his dad. And eventually he joined, the Worldwide Wrestling Federation when he got older. Although when he was a kid, he was a bit of a fuck up, and a lot of it was, I think, due to the fact that he had such a crappy childhood. And so his dad tried to straighten him up by putting him in a military school. And so what happened was, eventually the younger Vince joined the company, joined the WWF, and the two sides, things were, it's like, but the younger Vince wanted to do things on his own. He wanted to do his own promotions. He wanted to do his own things. And what happened was, one thing that he did was he did a promotional pay-per-view event that involved Evel Knievel. And it was in the early days of pay-per-view television. And he lost a lot of money off it. And what happened was Vince ended up bankrupt. I believe it was 1976 that Vince McMahon had to declare bankruptcy. And, he lost his home, he lost everything. Of course, didn't necessarily help that he had a daughter on the way. So this is what happened. Vince McMahon actually had to work in a foundry for a couple of years. And then anyway, he got himself back into good financial shape. And while doing so, it was announced that his father had cancer. So Vince, once again, who, like I said, just a few years prior, was bankrupt and lost everything, he remortgaged his house and tried to sell more things, what little he had left, to buy the WWF. And he did. He bought it from his dad, and soon he was making lots of money. And then he broke a rule that his father had with him. He said that if he broke a promise, and that promise was, do not buy our competitors. Do not buy the other members of our wrestling organization. And guess what Vince told his dad? You work for me now. I don't give a flying fuck, Dad. I want to have everything that I wanted as a child that you refused to give me, pretty much. And that's what happened. Vince, the younger Vince, Vincent Kennedy McMahon, fucked over his dad. And soon, there were hardly, it was the world, of course he renamed it WWF. He dropped the Y from their name. And it was true. Vince wanted it all. He wanted to have the life that he had not had as a child. And Vince became very wealthy. He had everything that he didn't have. Wrong one. He didn't have as a child. And he became very ruthless in the long run. Well, he had that secret weapon up his sleeve, and that name was Hulk Hogan. Of course, Hulk rose to fame in a little movie called Rocky III. He played Thunder Lips, and I guess it wasn't even a big role for him, but it put him on the radar. So what happened was Hulk Hogan would become the WWE's meal ticket, or as it was still called at the time, the WWF. And what happened was Vince McMahon was banking on Hulk to be the big star of the WWF. And of course, WrestleMania, he beat Andre the Giant, which shocked everyone. And then he became the big star of their merchandising and yada yada yada. He was the guy who carried the WWF well into the 80s. Now, if you're just an average wrestling fan, you probably don't know this story. But I'm going to tell you this story right now. So the WWF had a huge problem, and that was money. They were making money hand over fist, but most of the wrestlers were making humdrum money. So one day, one of those wrestlers, with Vince McMahon and all the promoters and all those people out of the locker room, he had a locker room meeting with everybody. And he announced that he wanted to unionize the WWF. All the wrestlers would fight for a fair wage. Now, Vince McMahon told everyone, do not, if I ever hear the word union come out of your mouth, you will be fired. And, way back in the 80s, there was a big push to bust unions, as we all know, thanks to Reagan. And, and of course, Vince McMahon was always a huge Republican. So what happened was so anyway, apparently one of the wrestlers that this man was talking to came to Vince McMahon and said, yeah, they were talking about unionizing and money and blah, 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 blah. And that wrestler got fired. And who was that wrestler? The future governor of Minnesota himself, Jesse the Body Ventura. And for years, Jesse told the WWE, WWF, WWE, whatever name they were this week, do not use my image or my voice in anything. And, Jesse, of course, that was definitely not the end of his career, obviously. He was in Predator, as we all know. I don't have time to bleed. I ain't got time to bleed. He's had a pretty good career post-wrestling. Let's not forget, he was in the Vietnam War. He, as a matter of fact, one reason why he actually had to retire from wrestling was because he had blood clots that were caused by Agent Orange. I actually knew somebody who died from Agent Orange. He was a Vietnam War vet, and his family for years and years have worked with other soldiers to talk about it. But anyway, so for years, Jesse the Body Ventura wanted to know who squealed. And he would finally get closure as to who squealed. And guess who it was? It was the Hulkster. Good old Hulk Hogan squealed because, I'll tell you why. Because it was discovered that Hulk was getting paid more money than all of the other wrestlers in the WWF combined. He didn't care about other wrestlers. He only cared about one man and one man only, and that was Terry Bollea, doing business as Hulk Hogan. So this is what happened. The reason why Jesse the Body Ventura learned about all this was because Vince McMahon was in court. And guess why he was in court, folks? He was in court because he was testifying about the steroid abuse in the WWF. And there were, of course, he was giving his wrestlers these drugs, and he did finally have to reveal in court that the WWF was going to unionize, but did not because the one person who told him was Hulk Hogan. He actually had to say it in court. He didn't plead the fifth on that one. So anyway, of course, in the 1990s, Hulk Hogan and the WWE parted ways. He went to WCW, the last other wrestling organization that was quite popular at the time. And Hogan and Vince McMahon parted ways. They stopped being friends and all that crap. And what happened was WCW became the number one wrestling organization. WWF also ran pretty much in the mid-90s. The NWO was their big stable that featured Hogan. And, of course, a lot of you might remember the theme song, which was made up of a bunch of samples of old Jimi Hendrix songs. And then what happened was, throughout the night, so this is what happened. The WWF saved their ass because they knew that they had to be more aggressive in their style of wrestling. And, of course, part of it was because of Shane. This is what happened. During a meeting one day, Shane McMahon was kind of bored. He took a pen and started drawing the WWF logo, and he was just scribbling it. And Vince McMahon looked at it over his shoulder, and he said, "Son, you just redesigned our logo." And that's what happened. Shane McMahon allegedly redesigned the WWF logo. So what happened was Shane McMahon, of course, you know, the McMahon kids were all a big part of the WWF empire. And then what happened was, by the late 1990s, the Attitude Era was taken over. Steve Austin, Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson, Mankind Mick Foley, D-Generation X. These people were turning the WWF into, they were basically saving the WWF. And WCW had another problem in their situation. So this is what happened. What was hurting the WWF? Well, so anyway, here's what happened. WCW, I should say, had become the WWF's bitch. They were, you know, by the late 90s, it was turning into a giant joke, especially when Ted Turner sold everything to Time Warner for $7 billion in 1997. And on the other hand, so what else was going on was that Time Warner had no use for WCW. The ratings had gone so low that, you know, I even remember they stopped. Yeah, they actually stopped showing. Yeah, they actually cut down on what was the Monday Night Show, whatever it was called. And so guess what? Who bought WCW? You guessed it, Vince McMahon. Vince McMahon bought WCW. And so he had everything to himself for a couple of years, including Hulk Hogan. He came back to the WWF. And, I mean, it was kind of awkward, obviously. But then Hulk Hogan jumped over to this new organization called TNA. TNA was formed by Jeff Jarrett, who, of course, used to be a WWE wrestler. He quit because of his dissatisfaction about what happened with Owen Hart. You know, he was the wrestler that died in a horrific accident when he was being roped down into the ring, and the rope broke and he fell on his head. And anyway, of course, the WWF they sued the rope manufacturer, or the harness, I should say. But it didn't mean nothing to him. He was angry. So he started this new organization with his dad. It was called TNA. They took up some former WWF wrestlers and up-and-comers, and they hired all these folks to come to work for their organization. And then one day they hired Hulk Hogan. They took him away from the WWF. They even put TNA Impact on Monday nights. I believe it was on the Spike Network, which is now Paramount. Well, of course, Raw was on USA, but it didn't work out. And then Hogan went back to the WWF. But of course, there was a series of unfortunate events. Of course, Hogan had, number one, of course, they had to change their name to the WWE because, of course, there was another WWF, the World Wildlife Fund, and they said, yeah, we own the copyright to that name, not you guys. And then what else happened was So yeah, they became WWE for World Wrestling Entertainment. And then what happened was, of course, Hulk had that show, Hogan Knows Best. That show was a huge hit. But then there was another problem. So this is what happened. Hogan was caught on tape. Yeah, it turns out that tape was not his good friend. So he was caught on tape. There was a sex tape going around that featured him and this woman named Heather Clem. Heather, of course, was the wife of the radio personality Todd Clem, a.k.a. Bubba the Love Sponge. And, of course, as Howard Stern fans know, Howard and Bubba were very good pals. When the FCC was going after shock jocks because of the Janet Jackson nip slip, what happened was Howard and Bubba both went to Sirius XM. Well, back then it was just Sirius. But anyway, Howard ended up getting Bubba the Love Sponge to be an ally in all this. And that's what happened. So the rest of the story was Vince McMahon. Why am I saying Vince McMahon? So Bubba the Love Sponge, his wife, Heather, had sex with Hulk Hogan. And they filmed it. And I guess the two sides said it was okay to do that. The wives, Bubba and Hulk, said it was okay. So guess what happened? They were caught having sex on tape. And then somebody took the tape and sent it in to Gawker. And Gawker showed the tape. And they were out there to defame Hulk Hogan. And Hulk sued. Not only did he sue, but he also had an ally in all this, and that ally's name was Peter Thiel. Peter Thiel was the founder of this company that you may have heard of called PayPal. It's the app where you can, switch money between friends and use the money to, of course, PayPal became quite a very popular site. And then what happened was, excuse me. So the story with PayPal was that he sold it to Elon Musk and his company, which at the time was called, surprise, X.com, which is now the new Twitter. But back then it was a website that Musk owned. So the rest of the story was that so what happened was now Peter Thiel was worth $20 billion. He spends a lot of money supporting ultra right-wing causes. Gawker outed him. It turns out that Peter Thiel is gay. A log cabin Republican. So Thiel gave the Hulkster like $10 million to sue Gawker.com. He claimed that Gawker took his property, and then at the end of the day, Gawker lost the lawsuit. Hulk wanted a ton of money, and Gawker was forced to close. Which a lot of people have said this was a huge loss for freedom of speech that day, because this site was very, spoke the truth, and the truth was Hulk Hogan was this holier-than-thou Republican and good family guy. But guess what? That sex tape ruined his marriage between him and his wife. And, of course, Hogan Knows Best also ended because his son Nick was drunk driving, and he, crashed his car, and his best friend ended up with brain damage. So, And of course, he was caught on tape again, on an audio tape where he's using the N-word a billion times. So the WWF fired him. And WWE, excuse me. Yeah, they were WWE now. But they fired him. They took him out of the WWE Hall of Fame, etc., etc. And then what happened was a lot of WWE fans stood up for Hulk and said, hey, Vince McMahon is also a user of the N-word. And guess what? He actually used it on Monday Night Raw a number of years ago. He said, what up, my N-word? And he said it in front of Booker T. And Booker T was like, he did not say that. Yeah, remember that? So the WWE rehired the Hulkster, and nobody liked him anymore. Every time he was in the ring, every time he was on stage, boo, Hulk sucks. Well, anyway, so the story was the WWE, over the years, they went from Attitude Era to TVPG era, as they call it, because, they decided to do away with the bloody matches and, the controversy surrounding Owen, Hart, and, a lot of these, and it's not just steroids, it's drug abuse in general, because of all these wrestlers who have all abused drugs, and the reality is Hulk Hogan was no angel. There we go. Sorry, I have to open a window or two. It's a little hot in here. So, anyway. So Hulk Hogan ended up... So anyway, here's what happened. Many years ago, Vince McMahon decided to take the WWE public in an IPO. And he became a billionaire. And then what happened was he made the decision again to sell the WWE and merge it with UFC in a new endeavor called TKO, oddly enough. So now this company called TKO Holdings, which by the way is a subsidiary of the Endeavor company, now owns the WWE. And for a while, Vince McMahon still had some say-so in the WWE, like 49%. But then it was discovered that Vince McMahon was doing some really disgusting things, like, mostly sexual assault. He was sexually assaulting women. He was paying them off. And some of the in some of the affidavits, it said that Vince actually pooped on women. And one woman said that she had really bad difficulty, cleaning up all the poop in her hair, and it's like it was a really gross fetish of his. So now they had to get rid of Vince, and now Vince has no, I don't know how much of WWE he still owns, if any, but he was let go from the company. And then when the WWE moved to Netflix earlier this year, they decided, okay, what we're going to do now is we're going to announce that we are starting a brand new future for the WWE. And they did it from, of all places, the Intuit Dome in Los Angeles, which is the new home of the Los Angeles Clippers basketball team. And as I explained to you in writing, the Los Angeles Clippers have long been the Lakers' bitch. They used to be owned by a very decrepit, disgusting old man named God damn it, what was his name? The guy who used to own the Clippers. But anyway, what happened was he was the guy who was caught on tape telling his mistress, do not take those guys, to not take those people to the games. And of course, his mistress was friends with black people. And anyway, under this guy's aegis, the team was always last place. Nobody liked them. They never had their own arena. Well, actually they did, but it was not as good as what the Lakers had. And, it was just... It was an absolute disaster. And anyway, there was this big brouhaha about, Donald Sterling. There we go. And believe it or not, he's still alive. Oh my God. Donald Sterling. So anyway, this asshole, he owned the Clippers, and he spent very little money on that team. And then he was caught on tape using... he didn't use the N-word. He just said, don't bring these people to the game. We need to stay classy and blah, 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 blah. And so what happened was this lady decided to show the NBA what was going on. And Sterling got banned from the NBA. And, of course, he ended up having to sell the team to Steve Ballmer. Ballmer was a former Microsoft executive. And he announced that the team was finally going to move out of Crypto.com Arena. It used to be the Staples Center where the Lakers play. And now they had their own arena for the first time ever. Crypto, which is the Intuit Dome. And so they decided, okay, we're going to have the first, the rebirth of Raw on Netflix in this arena. And guess who came to the party, and guess who got booed? Hulk Hogan. Everybody was booing him, and the mouth of the South, Jimmy Hart, was with him. Jimmy Hart, he was the guy who, became, he was like the major composer of all the music on the WWE shows. And Jimmy Hart was... he was one of the members of this 60s band called the Gentrys. They had a huge song called Keep On Dancing back in 64. It was a top 10 hit for them and became a standard on your local oldie station. And then what happened was, this came a short time after he decided to promote Donald Trump. He was going and doing these things with the Republican National Convention, tearing up his shirt, and there'd be a Trump Vance shirt underneath, and saying, "What you gonna do, brother, when Trump goes wild on you?" or whatever the fuck he was saying. So these are the only people who like him, because he's a Trump supporter. And yet, real wrestling fans hate the fact that he is a union buster. He is a racist. He doesn't care about other wrestlers. He doesn't even care about the First Amendment. Gawker.com told the truth, folks. He's an adulterer, and yet here he is playing Jesus. And I'm like, okay. Sorry, but not sorry. And what's funny is that he was only one of a small handful of celebrities who actually supported Trump. Him and Kid Rock, and the rest. Yeah, and people cry about liberal celebrities like Oprah and Taylor Swift, and yeah. And I'm like, okay, you want to know something, man? Oh, when was the last time Taylor Swift raped somebody? Never. When was the last time she screwed people over? Never. Hell, when Taylor Swift had that big tour recently, she paid her people. She gave a shit ton of bonuses to her people. That's how good, that's how wonderful of a human being she is. She cares about her fellow workers because she knows that she can't do it herself. You understand. But anyway, we all know Hulk Hogan died. And a lot of people are saying, years of steroid abuse may have played a role in his passing. It's so funny that as of late, just months ago, he was healthy and okay, and now he's gone. And here's my take, folks. Steroids will screw up your body. And it will screw up your mind. Look at what happened to Chris Benoit. Chris did a lot of drugs, and they say that by the time he died, his brain had he had the brain of an 80-year-old man. And then on top of that, it not only affects the people who take them, but it affects their families. Let me tell you a sad story, folks. I once had an uncle who used steroids. So, a number of years ago, so the story with my uncle was that he was using steroids. And my aunt, they weren't married at the time. My aunt actually had 2 boyfriends, him and another guy who was a really nice man. And he eventually was well-to-do with real estate. So, but anyway, my uncle, the roid user, he unfortunately, he came from a wealthy family, and he was a bodybuilder, and I guess one day he took out his car and he saw this other guy and tried to run him over. And what's even worse was that my aunt married this guy and had 2 children with him. And my aunt was the one doing all the work while he couldn't even keep on a job. He had really bad ADHD and yeah, he couldn't even work at a grocery store. But mommy and daddy had money. So this is what happened. So one day, my grandparents go down to Florida. They lived in Florida. My aunt, uncle, and 2 kids lived in Florida one time. They go down, and in my cousin's bedroom, there was no bed. They never slept on a bed before in their lives. Always on the floor. And my grandfather was pissed. So pissed that he instantly stormed off to a furniture store and got mattresses for the kids. And then, my aunt was the breadwinner. She had a career as a nurse, and she made decent money, but he couldn't even pull his weight. So this is what happened. So I was very young at the time, and I did not know this. But one day I was cleaning out my apartment one day, and I found one of my old elementary school yearbooks, and one of my cousins was in there. she was a year ahead of me. And what happened was, so I asked everybody, so when did she move to northern, when did she live up here? So this is what happened. My aunt told me that she and her husband were not in good terms. And they actually had to live with my grandparents for a while. And my mom even told me that she personally remembered going over there, and my aunt was, my male cousin was in tears, and she said, was cuddling next to him and saying, "Daddy will not hurt you anymore." We all knew that steroid abuse, this guy was abusing steroids, and he would get into roid rages. He would beat up his own children because he was such a douche. And then what happened was, finally, in the mid-90s or so, back when I want to say 95, 96 or so, my aunt got smart and kicked that guy, her husband, out of the house. And then a few years later, she learned that her other boyfriend, the one that she left for him, he was going through a divorce too. And he was a really sweet guy. His real estate business was doing good. He had a couple of young daughters. Everything was hunky-dory. Well, unfortunately, my aunt's son was just like his dad, except for the steroid part. And, he like his father had really bad ADHD, and he couldn't keep a job, and, he didn't do shit. So what happened was, so the story was, one of the problems that my aunt had was that she couldn't keep a house. She was living in apartment after apartment. They all lived in apartments for years. Then my aunt finally was able to buy a house. And when she bought her house, I guess the story was, she told her boyfriend at the time, "I'm not going to be able to pay my mortgage this month." And the reason why was because my male cousin, the one with ADHD, he had like this sports car. It was like a Mitsubishi or whatever the hell it was. And he never gave it oil changes. He never took care of it. And the engine blew. And so she had to pay to get a new engine for the car. So guess what the boyfriend did? He actually paid to fix the car so my aunt could pay the mortgage. And guess what happened? That was the last time she heard from him. They broke up without a word. And my feeling was, it was because my aunt had to choose between the good guy and the bad guy, and she ended up with the bad guy and had the bad guy's kids. And unfortunately, and here's something that makes my head spin, neither of my aunt's two kids work. Because the female cousin married a guy who was very wealthy. He owned a chain of tanning salons. She worked at one of them. They started dating. They had a kid together. They had another kid. They had very good money. course, they ended up selling everything and, moved around the country over the years. They now live in West Virginia. My male cousin, on the other hand, well, so this is what happened. My aunt had brain cancer. She ended up with brain cancer. And he moved to Detroit. He started dating a Chaldean woman. Well, her family was from Iraq. And so this long story short was that she wanted to continue on with her, she had a real estate business of her own. And anyway, long story short, she and him screwed over our family. And screwed over the will. My aunt wanted to be buried in Howard City which is right by Grand Rapids. But the story was my aunt's son and his wife, they were very religious, Catholic. And so the story is, my cousin has 4 kids with this bitch. My aunt, of course, passed away from cancer. And it's like, something, man? This is a huge reason why I will never date a woman with kids. And the reason why is because your motherfucking kids are your motherfucking problem. And I do not want to go through the same shit her ex-boyfriend went through. This guy deserved way better in life. I mean, he was a sweet man who was a great dad to his kids. And what was sad was that, he really wanted my aunt, and my aunt chose somebody else. And basically, the kids are a chip off, they call it the chip off the old block. My former uncle, the roid rager, the bodybuilder, was a loser. With a capital loser. And what's funny is they're very religious, they're very pro-Trump. And this asshole can't even get a job. Oh, but he's a good father. Yeah, and not only that, he also disowned our family. Yeah, how Jesus-like of you. This is why I am not a fan of organized religion, folks, and I'm not a fan of the mega types. I'm not a fan of these people. And the truth is coming out about Trump and his involvement with Jeffrey Epstein. The deposition, Jeffrey Epstein's deposition is everywhere. He pled the fifth when he was asked, were children under 18 present when you and Trump were present? Oh, I plead the 5th, 6th, and 7th Amendments. I'm not going to talk about that. Yeah, you're not going to talk about it because you're out there to protect Trump. And all I can say is, folks, is the truth is going to come out whether you like it or not. And maybe, who knows, maybe Hulk Hogan is on that list, on the Epstein list. It's all bullshit, folks. Hulk Hogan was a loser, plain and simple. And all I can say is, thank God he's dead. And, I used to love wrestling. I used to love, Steve Austin, The Rock, Mankind McFoley. They were my heroes growing up. And now if you ask me who my favorite wrestler in the WWE is, I can't tell you. Because I haven't watched any of their fucking shows in forever. Although I have seen that there's a lot of lifers still in the WWE. Like, I saw Randy Orton in there. RKO. I mean, he's got to be getting up there in years. But it is what it is, folks. Hulk Hogan is dead. And I'm really hoping that he ain't flying around with Ozzy and Malcolm Jamal Warner and, Chuck Mangione. They all died this week. They were all good guys. Oh yeah, another guy who died this week, George Coymans. He was the guitarist of the band Golden Earring. Yeah, he was. Yeah, Golden Earring. They had Radar Love and Twilight Zone. Yeah, he was another guy who passed away this week, and a lot of people don't know who the hell he was. Yeah, but anyway, you've heard his songs all the time. So anyway, I gotta get going. Yeah, I can't sit in this sweltering car for much longer. I gotta get my shopping done. I gotta go to Costco later today. So enjoy your weekend, and I will talk to you later. Looks like I'm buying a Ford. Am I correct? That's a Ford jingle. All right. I'm King Chuck. Bye for now.